welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii, our show, Urban Transcendence, Alia Mashta and Martin Despang. It's still your host, Martin Despang, over the summer broadcasting from Germany. You still see it's a show that is live here, see the cars, so pretty soon we're going to move around. But just as a little intro here, for today's show, thought about this very special day. This is the last day of June here in 2014, which nationwide is the Day of Architecture, which is an organization organized by the German Architectural Chamber, where everywhere in Germany a selected group of pieces of architecture, of projects, are shown to the general public. So we reflected on which project in Germany might be most interesting and relevant to the islands of Hawaii. And we found that building in the back here, which you can see. And for that reason, we had to move further east, pretty close to the Polish border, to the little town of Niesky. And the reason why is that we're going to talk about one of the legends in the field of the making of architecture, who is the legendary wood engineer and architect Conrad Waxman. And what you can see in the back is a building that Waxman did very early in his career, actually right before he did the building he's most famous for, which is a summer house for Albert Einstein near Berlin. And with that, I'm going to already introduce to you the experts that we will have today, which is Claudia and Rolf Klinkenbusch, who are local architects who do great work and also took it on to keep the legacy of this house, which is called the Wachsmann House. And the other person we flew him in from the United States, from Tucson, Arizona, and it's Emeritus Professor Larry Medlin, who was a personal friend of the legendary Conrad Waxman. So, great show today. Stay tuned. As promised, we're going to change the position so you're not distracted by the traffic that drives by. So, see you on the garden side of the building in a minute. So, we have now moved to the more quiet and more sunny, because southern side of the building, and the building again by the legendary wood engineer and architect Conrad Waxman. Just very briefly from my side, because I got way more qualified experts here left and right of me, but Waxman was born in 1901, and in 1927 he started to work very early for a local company here in town. And this building is a result, and the experts will talk more about that. And 2 years later, where he was still not even 30 years old, he worked with Einstein in Kaput near to Berlin. So why could this be of relevance for the islands of Hawaii? First of all, because Hawaii belongs to the United States of America, and Waxman had to immigrate soon after this and started his later career in the USA. And also because wood is a general field, he was particularly involved in industrialization and prefabrication of wood systems. And that's also something that, with a scarcity of material and the kind of through the roughness of labor on the islands of Hawaii, we might be able to learn something from the past. So to start off here, Larry, thanks for coming here all the way from the United States. And
my pleasure, Martin.
And you're one of the people who actually had the pleasure to know Conrad Waxman in person. So maybe you tell us a little bit about when you met him.
I met Konrad Waxman in the United States when I was a young architect and professor in St. Louis, and then later in Los Angeles, and he came to visit at my University of Arizona in Tucson several times. And I also met him at the Institute for Lightweight Structures, where Friado and his colleagues, one of which I was for early years, was there. So these were occasions in which, when you sat down with Conrad Waxman, he was a very gracious human being. He was wonderful to everybody. He did not discriminate against anyone. He loved children. He loved old people. But if he'd ask you, what were you doing? And well, at the time I was working on some energy conserving projects and solar utilization, and he would question you about, well, why was that important, you know? And then he would just wait for your response. And by that kind of provocation, you would have a wonderful discussion. And so before you knew it, you were talking about issues that back then were, what was the thematic terms and so forth, were energy conservation and that sort of thing. But the reality was that it soon evolved into the larger thing of using natural materials like wood and so forth. And that also went back to what I think was one unique characteristic of his work and his expertise, was that he was very good at working out and testing and doing details, but he also thought about the long-range picture. He wanted to know, where was this going to go? What are the next critical steps, and how can I learn and collaborate from other people?
That's exciting. So Claudia and Rolf, when did your initial access to Conrad Waxman begin? Where and when?
Ja, wir sind im Jahr 2001 auf ihn aufmerksam geworden im Zuge einer Ausstellung über Werkssiedlung des Deutschen Werkbunds Sachsen, und in dieser Ausstellung gab es Bilder von dem damals noch verfallenen Konrad Wachsmann Haus, und wir haben uns in der Folgezeit nach 2001 uns zunächst umfangreich theoretisch mit Konrad Waxmann, mit dem industriellen Bauen, mit dem Holzbauunternehmen Christoph und Unmark hier in Niesky beschäftigt und die Vorbereitungen, die planerischen Vorbereitungen getroffen und auch die Projektvorbereitung insgesamt, und der Bau hat begonnen dann, die Sanierungsarbeiten im Jahr 2011.
Also das war eine sehr lange Zeit, die auch dadurch geprägt war, dass wir 2002 zum ersten Mal eine Bestandserfassung gemacht haben von dem Gebäude und festgestellt haben, dass das eben auch sehr gut in Ordnung war, erstaunlicherweise nach dem langen Leerstand, und dann das Projekt begleitet haben, bis dann die Stadt Niesky das Gebäude 2005 gekauft hat, erstanden hat, woraufhin 5 Jahre später dann die nächste Bestandserfassung erfolgen musste, weil in der Zwischenzeit das Gebäude noch sehr viel mehr verfallen, sage ich jetzt nicht, aber es war die Zeit hatte durchaus daran weiter gemerkt.
So I'm, as always, going to translate to my best. So in around 2001, you first got or exposed yourself to Wachsman's work through an exhibition, and really got excited about his visions way back. And before the show, I'm going to share that we said, you know, and Larry said as well, that today there's a revival in wood construction, wood architecture, like there hasn't been like for a long time, but somehow sort of the great mastermind behind it, the pioneer, is kind of not that known anymore. Even in architecture schools, me as a teacher, I'm kind of surprised, or not to say shocked, how little of our students and colleagues as well, and people in general, don't know about Wachsman. So you yourself got yourself really excited about being exposed to his work, and then you being local architects, and again, I'm kind of doing something that I have a hard time, that I'm reducing us and you guys to something that's the topic of the show, which is Wachsman. But both Larry has an expertise that I haven't told you yet, but I do it now in front of the camera, so you can't say no. I want to have you on the show again with your expertise of lightweight structures, and it would be great to have you on the show about your great work, because you're contemporary architects and do great stuff. In fact, you showed a new building that you constructed today before this show here of this house. But regardless, or because you were really excited about this history, and you took on that project almost as a research project first, and did a lot of investigation. And you say the house has been vacant and basically deteriorating for many years. It's been in use in the GDR days, but then hasn't been occupied. So from the time that you got interested in, and by the time you were able to sort of, you know, basically be infectious almost and get other people excited, time went by, bureaucracy and funding and all these things, and at that time the house deteriorated even more, so it was really, really necessary to do something, which you actually have done, and this is the result of it. So I think we're going to make a little technical break here, and we're going to move on and move into the building, and as we discussed, sort of walk the audience through the building. So we're going to have certain you know, sections, and so we just walk through the building and walk and talk. So, all right. So see you in a second in the building. Okay, so we moved inside of the house. Now we're on. And so we moved inside of the house, are in the central space here. And another theme of our show has developed and actually initiated, traces back to Ali as the co-host, is the keiki. So keiki are the children in Hawaii. So Larry, I know from our talk that you have some very special memories of Conrad as a father as well.
We had many opportunities to visit him in his Schindler home in Los Angeles. And my children were invited and included in several of those things. He would engage the children individually, would show them magic tricks, he would get them excited and always ask about them. But when I was getting ready to come over here on this trip, I told them I was going to have a chance to visit this wonderful house that Wachsmann had designed. Local architects had worked to sort of restore and present to the public. And I asked them if they remembered Conrad Waxman, and they were like 7, 8, and 13 at the time, and they were young children. I wondered if they, and each one of them individually not only remembered him, they presented him with a big smile and admiration and told me in detail that I didn't remember, but they each remembered. So he was really a very wonderful, engaging human being. Mm-hmm. I mean, he liked to watch popular American television shows because he wanted to learn about Americans and stuff. Mm-hmm.
That's amazing. So that gives us a chance actually to segue to Claudia and Rolf again. And I should say, I always see you guys as an entity, and you are in many ways, but as far as your fields of expertise here is that you, Claudia, as the trained as an art historian, you are your responsibility was and is continued to be the curation of the house, a lot about the interiors, but also an exhibition that we're going to go to that also traveled. Whereas Rolf's part was mainly about the building itself and its technological and you know, upgrading to code. We're standing here. I touched something that didn't used to be part of the original, but things have changed, and this is a building that is not a museum primarily with museum guards. This is a pretty public building that actually people can walk around, so it had to be upgraded to code. So from you guys, I would be interested to hear about that. After this initial, I call it the phase of euphoria, I think from what we had talked, there was this phase of when you actually found out what you really had started and what you had taken on. So it would be great to hear how that phase was. Also diese Phase wo ihr richtig saht, worum es denn eigentlich ging.
Also wir waren uns mit der Sanierung der Außenfassade relativ früh in den Planungsprozess sicher, welche Aufgabenstellungen, welche Schwierigkeiten und auch welche Möglichkeiten die Sanierung haben wird. Was eine große Überraschung war, ist, dass hier noch unter den ganzen Farben der inneren Oberfläche noch eine komplette Farbfassung gefunden wurde, die auf die Gestaltung von Konrad Wachsmann zurückgeht. Das war sehr spät und wir sind deshalb sehr froh darüber, dass wir diese Farbfassung wieder bringen konnten. Das war mit sehr großem Aufwand verbunden, weil große Mengen an Farbschichten entfernt werden müssten. Das hat sich über einen sehr langen Zeitraum hingezogen, aber im Ergebnis haben wir jetzt hier diese mit sehr intensiven Farben geprägten Oberflächen, die nochmal einen ganz anderen Charakter des Hauses bilden, gerade von dem Hintergrund, dass es im Äußeren ja eher von dem dunklen Braun, fast schwarz geprägt ist und im Inneren eine sehr intensive kontrastreiche Farbigkeit offenbart.
So you explained that when you started off, you started, as most architects do, with a sort of an outside-in approach, you know, having ideas and having a concept about the restoration of the exterior facade was pretty easy, but on the inside there was a surprise when you started to take off the layers of paint. Underneath you found the original, what ended up being the original colors that actually were very surprising, because the house is sort of more hermetic, more maybe austere. Some people would think it's dark brown, almost blackish. Whereas on the inside, in contrast to that, Wachsmann has decided for a very sort of playful color palette, and as you guys can see here, there's the red of the guardrail, the blue of the doors, and this kind of beige, kind of greenish color concept. Okay, so we're back. This show again, this gives me the chance to thank our producer Lutz Behnke again, who's behind the camera, makes it look professional. Thank you very much, Lutz, again. And thank you, Ian and Marshall, for working with Lutz overseas. So we're now here to talk a little bit about the time when actually Wachsmann then had to leave Germany, as many other, Lutz and I were talking before the show with Larry about this kind of really tragic phase that Germany lost all its smart brains due to that regime. But for the US, it supposedly was a good thing. So both Gropius and Wachsmann basically had to leave the country and actually met again and basically teamed up. And you also have some great memories of Conrad talking about these days. Maybe you want to share these.
He was talking about that day of how actually Gropius assisted him somewhat in his planning to get over to America. And he ended up being invited and living in the basement of Gropius's house. And that's when they decided to collaborate, and they developed the general panel house. And, you know, there he was in the basement doing these drawings, you know. And 2 years ago, the Museum of Modern Art had an exhibit on a prefabricated building, and there were those 6 or 8, I'm not sure exactly how many drawings, but large drawings exhibited there, just perfectly rendered. I mean, way beyond the quality of what young people tend to do today, because they do it all on their computers. And it was absolutely fantastic. I mean, I remember him talking about it and seeing them and seeing that quality. It literally brought tears to my eyes.
Amazing. Sounds very touching. And it gets us to the constructability or the tectonics of these buildings. So you're talking that kind of prefab house that they had envisioned for the US to become a mass, you know, produced house, which unfortunately for some reason so the capitalized mechanisms and I guess building industry unfortunately didn't buy into, so it basically kind of flopped. And so this building here has some similar issues, different but similar, and we should say Conrad Wachsmann was a pioneer and he was an inventor. He invented all that stuff, and to a certain degree, you know, he was a genius. That's maybe, you know, also the reason why he ended up being favored by Albert Einstein. You know, there was a good match. These were really, really smart, extraordinary brains and leaders. So this building here is also, it might look like a log system, but in fact it's actually not. So Rolf, if you would like to share with us how it's actually built and what the challenge was to keep it alive.
Die Blockbauweise, die hier Konrad Wachsmann angewendet hat, besteht aus schlanken, nur 7 cm hohen und 17 breiten und 17 cm hohen Vollholzblöcken, die übereinander gestapelt werden. Und es ist eine Bauweise, die sehr sensibel ist als Blockbauweise und in regelmäßigen Abständen immer wieder Unterstützung braucht. Wir stehen hier vor einem großen Fenster in der Nordfassade Und Konrad Wachsmann hat hier ein sehr großformatiges, 6 Meter langes Fenster eingebaut, was nicht unbedingt für die Blockbauweise so geeignet ist. Und so gab es während der Sanierung hier auch die Notwendigkeit, das ganze Haus mit einer Seilspannung zusammenzuziehen, weil sich auf der Nordfassade eine Fassadenausbeulung ergeben hat. Das konnten wir im Zuge der Sanierung wieder zusammenziehen und jetzt steht das Haus relativ gerade wieder da.
So you explain that, again, what looks like, so these kind of approximately, we have to convert 17 centimeters. US hasn't yet made the conversion metric, never mind. So it's about 7 inches high. So that was reminiscent of sort of the solid log timber in the more southern parts of Germany, the Bavarian Alps. But in fact here, because this was about optimization, industrialization, making it more efficient and effective, also cost effective, the actual width is actually only about approximately 3 inches, 7 centimeters. So very much sort of slicing it down. There's one of the new coming up technologies today is cross-laminated timber that sort of have a comparable width, but they're a totally different structural system. They're planes, and these are planks. These are individual planks. So there was a very sophisticated tongue and groove system where they kind of interlock into each other, but regardless, them being so thin led to that the building was basically moving over the years, and that north facade here was basically bowing outside. So it was basically sagging towards this direction. And so that was a significant, and that's majorly also caused by sort of this element here, this wide, very wide spanning column-free window that's very clearly sort of a synonym of modernism. The horizontal banged windows are an icon of modernity. So there was this kind of struggle between sort of the attempt to innovate a traditional system and then this integration of clearly provocative modern elements. So you say that in the renovation, which reminds me a little bit of the renovation of Falling Water, where these balconies by Frank Lloyd Wright were sagging and they were drilling through tie rods, or in fact cables, and you did the same here. That basically you were kind of bringing tying this wall back to other parts of the building. And when we were outside before the show, you showed me that you were very interested in not entirely hiding that process. So you can actually see some circles in the facade. And these circles are basically where you were kind of drilling through, you were recessing the bolt, and then you were finishing with a round piece of wood so that it wouldn't be faked. So it's obviously not trying to celebrate that, but it's also not trying to hide that. So I really, find that very impressive if you would. So, all right, let's move on to other exciting spatial experiences in this impressive house. So we're here on the south side of the building in the main living rooms. A very clever way this building here is organized, from my understanding, and again I'm not the expert, but from my feeling, very much sort of a precursor to the Einstein house, where the building is actually a rather simple building from sort of an outside more sort of disengaged view, but once you start to engage with the house, it starts to be very, very cleverly orchestrated, very functional on one hand, but on the other hand, very, very experiential. So Larry, again, Wachsmann as the great inventor, and so maybe you want to share with us a little bit about, you met him sort of rather late in his life, so this is a very early phase in his life, but when you talked to him, he had accumulated a lot of other phases and worked with a lot of other important people in architecture.
That's true. And his teaching, he collaborated with a lot of other people. Like, for example, two of them are Otto and Mies van der Rohe. Mies van der Rohe was in IIT in Chicago, and one of Mies's quests was for the universal space. And so that was something that he admired. and he gave consideration to. And then from Friado, he also appreciated the use of minimal materials and how you could maximize the ability of tensile elements to span along things. So if you look at one of his last projects, which was published in California Arts and Architecture, it was a Great American City Hall. It was a beautiful horizontal large span structure with an elegantly designed set of pylons to receive that load, creating a vast free span intended to be a major public space.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, and you know, this room here is sort of introducing that very early, this wide open space and being very flexible. So Claudia, could you explain? We have some boards here, so this is your work, or in front of your work. This is your exhibition, very delicately composed and constructed, and that's work in progress because we're going to end up going into the basement of the building at the end. We can see there's a lot more to come. But here, maybe you can share with us how we know how the house was conceptualized as a single-family residence with 3 children. But then when the original client sort of moved out, can you share with us the stages and each stage, sort of which were the challenges for the building?
Also gebaut für eine Familie mit 3 Kindern und aber kurz nach der Errichtung ist diese Familie schon wieder ausgezogen. Und es ist ein einziges Paar ohne Kinder hier eingezogen. Die haben auch einige Veränderungen gemacht. Die haben vor allem zusätzliche Gebäude im Gartenbereich errichtet. Die haben Garagen dann und sich Autos zugelegt und so weiter. Aber im Grundsätzlichen ist es hier erhalten geblieben. Wir befinden uns jetzt hier in den ehemaligen Herrenzimmer. Das ist eine Art Bibliotheksraum, Arbeitsraum gewesen, der sich anschließt an das Musikzimmer und das Speisezimmer, die alle zusammen miteinander verbunden sind und auch als solche dann in der Zeit so genutzt wurden bis 1945. Da gab es nach Ende des Zweiten Weltkriegs gab es hier eine öffentliche Nutzung. Also zunächst war eine städtische Einrichtung hier drin und dann gab es die FDJ-Kreisleitung, die hier eingezogen ist. Die haben hier ihre Veranstaltungen abgehalten, die haben hier gefeiert. Das war eine Art Jugendzentrum dann im Prinzip auch und war natürlich dann eine ganz andere Nutzung. Und wir waren sehr erstaunt, dass trotz dieser wirklich sehr anderen, auch öffentlichen Nutzung, nicht mehr enorme Veränderungen hier stattgefunden haben. Es ist sehr genutzt worden. Hier sieht man mal ein Bild aus den 80er Jahren, also es war sehr heruntergekommen und ist erst dann grundlegend saniert worden, als bekannt wurde, dass das Haus von Konrad Wachsmann ist. Konrad Wachsmann war in den 70er Jahren hier, hat viele Vorträge gehalten und war dann im öffentlichen Bewusstsein. Und da ist das Haus dann eben auch unter Denkmalschutz gestellt worden und es gab eine große Sanierung, die dann Ende der 80er Jahre abgeschlossen wurde. Danach hat das Haus dann nach 89, nach der Wende, leer gestanden. Bis jetzt eigentlich, bis 2014. Also das heißt, 25 Jahre hat es praktisch leer gestanden. Und das ist der Zustand, den wir hier vorgefunden haben. Das Haus war ohne Nutzung, es war eingewachsen schon fast. Also auf der Terrasse wuchsen schon die Birken und es wurde höchste Zeit, dass was gemacht wurde.
Yeah. So you said, as you picked up where I ended in saying, well, it was conceptualized and designed for a family with 3 children who actually didn't stay here very long, and then a family, or a couple without children moved in. And although they were adding on to the building, basically in the landscaping, there were garages and cars, and they did some minor adjustments and changes, but basically the house wasn't significantly changed in that part. And then sort of that was a private function, and from there on it was sort of publicly used as sort of a little town center, and then later on, after the war, actually then sort of as a youth center. The GDR had their very special organization for the youth, and so this is where basically they came together at their gatherings. And you said, considering that, this was really hardest wear and tear with young people who wanted to express themselves. it actually, to your surprise, survived that phase fairly well also. And in fact, during the GDR, Wachsmann came back and raised sort of an awareness for what this really means. And during the GDR, they started to do major renovations. Before the show, you said they stripped off the coating of the wood, which you explained to me was good, because at least it grayed and it sort of, organically disintegrated, but at least it didn't ruin it, because it was able to dry out and get wet again, dry out again. So it was actually a good thing. It kind of preserved it. Whereas sort of the major kind of where everything went down the hill was almost ironically after the reunification, where sort of no one was interested in the house anymore, and it basically was vacant for 25 years, and these 25 years actually did it to the house and basically got it into a really seriously endangered situation. So that's a very interesting. So you point out here some pictures from the different phases here, and this one here is just sort of the thermographic picture that also talks about or visualizes the challenge from a building that's basically a structural skin, right? So these like 7 centimeters, 3 inches, basically wood boards were the only skin that was structural, as we talked about before, but also that was the only thermal enclosure. So maybe you guys want to also talk a little bit about that challenge, because once you touch a building, although it was under the historic register already since the 80s, so that during the GDR it was already on the register, but once, after the reunification, once you touch a building and you put it back to use, you have to put it, deal with it to build it up to code, to energy code. So maybe you want to share also ein bisschen auch diese Herausforderung erklären, dass eben dann diese thermische Ertüchtigung sozusagen des Hauses, wie ihr damit umgegangen seid.
Ich kann ja mal den Anfang machen. Das Gebäude wird ja jetzt auch wieder öffentlich genutzt, und zwar als Museum. Im Kellergeschoss ist das historische Archiv der Stadt untergebracht, und im Obergeschoss werden Büroräume eingerichtet werden. Das hat natürlich sehr unterschiedliche klimatische Anforderungen und vor allem auch sehr hohe klimatische Anforderungen. Also ein Archiv muss natürlich trocken sein, muss warm sein und muss eine konstante Temperatur halten. Ebenso das Museum, und im Obergeschoss, wo früher die Schlafräume waren, die nicht gedämmt waren, da war wirklich nur die 7 cm Außenhaut. Da musste natürlich was passieren, damit die Leute da auch drin arbeiten können und auch im Winter drin arbeiten können. Und zur Dämmung kannst du ja vielleicht noch was sagen?
Ja, im Ursprung war das Gebäude in den Gesellschaftsräumen, die hier diese Plattenoberflächen hatten, auch mit einer dünnen, 1 Inch dicken Dämmung versehen. Und wir haben dieses Grundprinzip der Innendämmung auch bei der Sanierung beibehalten, sodass etwas optimiert, bauphysikalisch abgestimmt, aber dass die Grundkonzeption, die klimatische Grundkonzeption des Hauses beibehalten wird. Der Keller ist hochgedämmt mit dem Archiv, weil wir dort sehr umfangreich gearbeitet haben, und das Dach hat ebenfalls eine hohe Dämmschicht bekommen. Die Fenster wurden erhalten, aber verbessert in ihrer Dämmung und Luftdichtigkeit, sodass wir fast die heutigen gesetzlichen Anforderungen an die Energetik von Gebäuden, Neubauten erreichen.
So that's very interesting that Claudia starts off to say that since the use of the building has significantly changed over time from an initially domestic typology to a public one and office use more, which is now actually the case as well, that it's a museum and there's going to be some office space upstairs, so it needed to be improved. And even previously, sort of, they differentiated. There was the bedrooms were the kind of the cold places, but then there are rooms of longer occupation, actually, as Rolf points out, as well as what's behind this here. There is like an inch thin, has been an inch thin insulation behind these panels of plywood. And they basically accepted the house within its concept, also its energy concept, and just refined it, as opposed to sort of drastically changing it, which inherits the problem to screw up, because you sort of start to misinterpret the genetic code of the building. You basically understood it, respected it, and very, very fine-tuned each and every building component to a degree that now it's almost up to current energy code, which is pretty impressive. We're standing here in front of the southern facade, so we can feel that solar gain that's coming in. And the building doesn't have a lot of thermal mass, so you can also vent out the heat pretty efficiently and effectively. So that's very impressive. Okay, so we move on. I think probably one more time or two more times. So,
Okay.
So we're here in front of the exhibit again. Another part of the exhibit that Claudia is going to tell us about in a minute here. It starts here with telling the life and the steps of Conrad Waxman, and of course here's that most, I guess, popular or populistic shot of a very young, I think he was 29, 28, I guess, 28 at the time when he met Albert Einstein. And so this is this kind of classical shot. And then of course, as Claudia points out in the board, that kind of boosted his career, building up his own sort of career as an architect in his office. But also one says in the exhibit, tells that actually as real buildings, he hasn't actually built that much. And so this being actually one of the few buildings he built, and a very, very early one. So you having met him at sort of towards more the end of his career, what are your kind of feelings about, the space that he created here? And also, why do you think was he so qualified to design for someone like Einstein?
Well, he was a very good listener, and he would talk to people, and he would have them describe what they wanted to do, and then he would share with them his philosophy of the prefabrication and things that he wanted to do, but particularly how to work with nature and natural materials. And this was in a beautiful natural setting. As you can see, some of the other classic photos of this are coming out on the balcony with nature surrounding that. But he also said some interesting things like, he asked Einstein how big of a library he wanted. And Einstein's reply to him was, one bookshelf. You only have one or two books that are really important that you actually read and use.
That's cool. So, talking exhibiting and how much you need, tell us a little bit about the exhibit here and when you created it and how long it has been around and where has it all been?
Also das ist jetzt hier die Wanderausstellung, die 2005 erstellt wurde, nachdem die Stadt das Haus gekauft hat. Und wir einfach Werbung machen wollten für das Projekt und es auch einfach bekannt machen wollten. Wir brauchten Fördermittelgeber, wir brauchten auch die Zustimmung der Bevölkerung in Niesky. Und so habe ich einfach mal die Grundlagen des modernen Holzbaus, die Person des Architekten Konrad Wachsmann und auch die Firma, die diese Häuser gebaut hat, Christoph und Unmark, in dieser Ausstellung dargestellt und präsentiert. Und diese Ausstellung startete natürlich hier in Niesky, ist dann aber durch die ganze Bundesrepublik gereist, aber eben auch nach Polen, wo auch noch ein Konrad Wachsmann Haus steht, in Ratibor. Da gibt es noch das Erdwissenschaftliche Institut von Konrad Waxman, auch noch fast im Original erhalten. Und dort wurde es auch gezeigt und ist dann auf Wanderschaft gegangen. Es war auch in den Niederlanden, es war in vielen Universitäten, sodass also auch viele Studenten die Ausstellung gesehen haben. Und das machte die Nieskier natürlich auch stolz, dass das immer durch die Weltgeschichte gereist ist und hat auch ein bisschen dazu geführt, dass das Projekt auch Anerkennung gefunden hat. Das ist die Wanderausstellung, das ist praktisch vorab. Die eigentliche Dauerausstellung, die in diese Räume kommt, die hat im Prinzip die gleichen Themenstellungen. Also das ist ein Teil der Ausstellung, das ist schon mal der erste Teil, der fertiggestellt wurde, der dann in diesen 3 Gesellschaftsräumen, die Ausstellung, die dann in 3 Gesellschaftsräumen gezeigt wird. Und
so you explain this is the initial travel exhibit that had a very strategic reasoning because it was right after the community here, the city, bought the building and you started to want it to work. but you needed to raise many things. You needed to raise money. You needed to raise an appreciation within the community. And all of that, you thought, from your discipline of being an art historian and a curator, an exhibit would do the best job. So you basically focused on Waxman himself, on sort of his agenda of wood construction, on the company, the local company he worked for, and you developed this here, and it traveled very intensively through Germany, through Poland, through the Netherlands, and many universities, and actually did a good job. And very important, it sort of backed up the local people by that they've done the right thing. They've been so courageous in saying, okay, we want to do that. It just, reinforced that. Of course, it helped with the fundraising, so it was the right decision to do that exhibit. And
es gab auch noch einen Ausstellungskatalog, der auch gleichzeitig erstellt wurde und der auch ein Architekturführer zu den Holzbauten hier in Niesky. Es gibt 100 Holzhäuser noch in Niesky, auch von Christoph und Unmark. An vielen hat Konrad Wachsmann mit Sicherheit auch mitgewirkt bei der Konzeption. Aber dieses Haus ist in Niesky das einzige, was, wo wir wissen, dass es auf Konrad Wachsmann zurückgeht. Aber dieses Buch hat natürlich auch dazu beigetragen, dass es auch echt mehr bekannt wurde.
So along with the exhibit went a catalog, and the catalog also had a register of all the buildings by Wachsman as well here in Niesky. And there are actually several more that it's not quite clear, to what extent he contributed, but it's very likely because he worked for them. But he was an employee. So this building, he was the architect of record, so he was the architect officially. And the other ones, he was kind of unofficially or part of the company. But it's very likely when you look at the building and you see their philosophy that they're a part of that.
Yeah.
So all of that really, really helped to raise the awareness and the necessary funding for the project. And then last but not least, there will be a permanent exhibit here in the building, and the boards we saw in the previous scene are actually also already the first ones for the permanent. And I think we're slowly but surely running out of time, so we're going to walk to the last, setting of here, and that's going to be in the basement, and that has a lot to do with the permanent exhibit and with an archive. So see you down there. So this seems like a rather unusual closing the show, but it's actually very important to do that here. This is a very important space, and like many times in life, the things you don't see are the most important. So why is this such an important space, Paul?
Dieser Raum wird zukünftig das Stadtarchiv der Stadt Niesky aufnehmen, und damit die Räume überhaupt als Archiv genutzt werden konnten, mussten wir den Fußboden des Hauses, diesen Fußboden unter den Gesellschaftsräumen, nach unten absenken. Wir sehen jetzt an dieser Stelle noch die alte Fundamentkante, und darunter sehen wir hier die neue Grundplatte mit den Rollschienen für das Rollarchiv. Diese Räume sind klimatisch sehr stabil, wir sind sowohl lichttechnisch als auch klimatechnisch ausgestattet, um hier dauerhaft gute Bedingungen für die Archivalien das ganze Jahr über zu gewährleisten. Also eine hohe Kontinuität an klimatischen Voraussetzungen für das Stadtarchiv. Bautechnisch war das sehr schwierig auszuführen, quasi ein Haus unter das Haus zu bauen, aber wir haben das obere Haus, das Holzhaus, teilweise, ich nenne es mal so, fast in der Luft gehalten, um hier drunter dann ein tieferes Haus zu bauen, und den Übergang bildet dann auch aus Brandschutzgründen die Betondecke zu dem oberen Holzhaus.
So you explain that another very clever idea, from my understanding, is to actually give the building another function. We actually have a wedding ceremony going up upstairs right now, but this here is going to be the city's archive. And in order to do that, this would not have been able to be accomplished within They actually very low ceiling, almost like only 6 to 7 feet ceiling. And so in order to do that, you did this, tremendous undertaking to almost have the above ground building float temporarily, somehow clip it to clouds and let it float, and build this here underneath. And this here underneath is, this is actually here the former foundation, which again, in a very nice way to compliment you on leaving these traces and showcasing. You could easily chip this clean and flush and plastered it over, but you wanted to show, you wanted to keep sort of the scars of the layers of time. So here, you can see on the ground, these are the tracks for the future movable archive shelves. And what you see on top is a concrete ceiling. And so all of this together also makes it a very climatically stable environment that is conducive and qualified for the requirements of archiving. But the ceiling has also the other function that it brings the building up to code as far as the fire rating requirements. So with that, we want to close the show, but not before we mention that if you guys hopefully got more appetite about the life and work of Conrad Waxman, there is some literature around, and maybe you want to talk a little bit about.
Ja, also anlässlich der Eröffnung des Hauses habe ich ein Buch erarbeitet zur Geschichte des Hauses, in der natürlich auch zur Geschichte Konrad Wachsmanns und analog eben auch zur Ausstellung zur Geschichte der Christoph und Ulmark AG, aber eben im Wesentlichen zur Geschichte dieses Hauses, zur Sanierungsgeschichte, zur Nutzungsgeschichte und auch begleitet durch einen Fotografen, der seit 2006 professionelle Fotos von allen Phasen der Sanierung gemacht hat, die sehr schön teilweise auch geworden sind, die alle in diesem Buch dann auch gezeigt werden, teilweise auch großformatig.
Okay.
Und ja, ist eine schöne Möglichkeit, sich so dem Haus anzunähern, weil es eben von unterschiedlichen Aspekten her.
That's great. Yeah. So not enough with the 2 exhibits we talked about to show us the temporary one and the permanent one. You took on another project, which was a book. And everyone who hasn't done the book yet, you don't know what that means. It means a lot. So great job. It's basically a documentary of the history and also the process. You're very smart to actually have hired a photographer who was with you in documenting everything ever since the beginning of 2006. So everything is basically documented and it looks great. So all that, led to the great book. Also, the audience should sort of request an English version, and we could convince the publisher to do that. So that's great. Larry, you want to add something about further research and literature?
Well, one of his classic book that he wrote was about the evolution and the future of buildings. So he wrote a book called The Turning Point of Building that presents his assessment of what the issues were, what his values were, and a fairly comprehensive survey of projects that he did espousing his principles and examples of work. But in my opinion, it's been extremely valuable to me as an architect throughout my career, and I think really relevant to emerging changes and issues and opportunities of today's times.
All right. Well, so with that, Claudia and Larry and Rolf, thank you very much for this very exciting 50 minutes about a very, very exciting project about an amazing man, Conrad Waxman. So thank you all very much, and see you guys soon on our next show.